few days ago here on the channel, I was talking about the reaction of some comic book creators to the current market. The fact that it's easier to get a comic book published today, but it's harder to get people to actually buy it. That kind of broke it all down, and I got a little heated. I'll admit that. I went on a little rant-a-rooski. I got a little hot. I got a little passionate. That's what I got. Passionate about comic books, how we got here, and why all this stuff needs to stop. And I am not going to reach those levels of passion in this video. I've definitely calmed down after that, but I still have a lot of passion for comic books. I want to see things change. And what I've noticed, in the comic book ecosphere, when it comes to YouTube, there are other people that do what I've been doing for the last 6 years. And a lot of times you see them transition out of comic books into something else, despite the fact that they're actually pointing out what's going on here, what's wrong, that things never change. And if you do the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a new result, that is the definition of insanity. I'm not insane because I've never expected things to change. I've never expected DC, Marvel, the indie comic scene, any of these creators to actually say, you know what, Wes, what you're saying is very logical. It actually makes complete sense. You've backed it up with facts and statistics and all this stuff. We're going to start writing better stories and care about the customers. I never expected that to happen. And that's why I don't get fed up and just leave and go find something else to do. But it does get, admittedly, a little bit lonely when there aren't very many other people covering the comic book industry with the type of passion that I have, with a little bit of common sense to go along with it. Thankfully, our boy Mark Millar has a little bit of passion for comic books and some common sense. And recently he had a reaction to Jim Hanley University, JHU comic shop in Manhattan, closing down. We knew this was going to be happening for about a month now, but they had a Facebook post basically saying, hey, on Wednesday is our last day. We're shutting down. We would like volunteers to help us stock and all that kind of stuff over to the flagship comic book shop because they still will have a presence, just not on Manhattan. And Mark Millar was not happy about this. In fact, he had a very visceral, passionate reaction to this. And then there's another thing I want to cover at the end, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Somebody chimed in that I never would have expected to, claiming that he's been me all along. I couldn't believe it. This is what Mark Millar had to say reacting to the Facebook post. Jim Hanley's store in New York is closing. Unthinkable news, and surely to God, a wake-up call to the big two. Marvel, DC, and all of the U.S. indie companies added together are now 9% of the American domestic market. How does this happen when the characters are more famous than ever? That has been the really enormous question that's been lingering over the comic book industry for the past decade now. Once you saw all the success of the MCU and the notoriety of the characters and everyone loving the Avengers and Captain America's the greatest and Iron Man's been rejuvenated. Hell, Guardians of the Galaxy have all this publicity now. People know who they are. They know who the characters are. They know what the universe is. The jumping on point should really be the easiest thing in the history of comic books because Joe Schmuckatelli knows who the characters are. They know what the universe is. They know the origin stories of these characters, and there should be nothing stopping them from going to their comic book shop and jumping in. And I imagine a lot of people did do that. They got out of their Avengers movie. They're like, my goodness, I'm going to have to wait another 3 years for another Avengers movie. I can't take enough of this. And I need to go to a comic book shop and see if I like the Avengers comic book. And of course, if you got in there at the time, there would have been no Iron Man. There was Iron Heart. Captain America wouldn't have been leading the team. In fact, it was probably Falcon Cap at the time, or Captain Marvel, my bad, would have been leading the team. And every character that they were familiar with would have been changed other than Hulk, I believe. Although we did have Amadeus Cho Gogurt Hulk at the time, but I don't think he was actually like on the Avengers team. I think there was actually the real Hulk there. And as a new reader, as somebody that was familiar with the characters in the universe, you would have been like, I don't know what any of this is. And it feels like one of the biggest missed opportunities really in the history of the comic book industry. They really dropped the ball on that one. Obviously, the DCEU never took off quite like it is, but everyone knows who Batman is. Everybody knows Batman's origin. Everyone knows who Superman is. Everyone knows Superman's origin. A lot of these characters are so well known. They're more famous than ever. They're selling more shirts than ever. They're selling more action figures than ever. They're selling more lunch boxes than ever, more backpacks than ever, but they're not selling more comic books than ever because the stories, quite frankly, suck right now. And that's where you get to a point where your 9% of the entire market in North America is DC, Marvel, and indie comics, actual American publishers. They're getting destroyed, obviously, by manga. Manga has taken over, especially in the book chain where all the growth is going on and people have flocked to as a refuge away from the terrible storytelling at DC and Marvel Comics. And really, if we're being honest, the indie scene in general, there's a lot of terrible comic books going out there. And at this point, there are no excuses left to make. You've had enough time to understand the audience and why they're leaving. You've had enough time to realize that changing all the characters and doing race swaps and gender swaps and doing sexuality reveals for all these characters has not done anything for the comic book industry other than drive people off. There are no more excuses to make about why none of this stuff worked out, because we certainly have had plenty of anomalies out there where things just kind of blow up, and they always have the same thing in common, right? They get back to the basics, they get back to the character, and they tell a cool story instead of trying to teach people or influence people, which it feels like a vast majority of comic book writers are trying to do these days. Yes, there are exceptions. There are some really good writers out there that likely will never get their big break. They will never really be discovered on the level commensurate with their abilities these days, because they're sitting on a rack just full of obscure comic books from people nobody wants to read, and people just assume they're part of that thing. Phil Kennedy Johnson should be a bigger deal than he is. Ryan Parrott should be a way bigger deal than he is. And a lot of people don't even know who these guys are because no one likes Batman right now, because no one likes the X-Men right now. No one really likes Spider-Man right now. All the tentpole characters really outside of Superman, who I guess is having a resurgence now that Brian Michael Bendis and Tom Taylor are done destroying the character, is having a little bit of success, but it's not nearly as successful as it was before Brian Michael Bendis destroyed the character. It's not nearly as successful as it was before Tom Taylor came on board and decided he needed to shake things up. In a follow-up to that tweet, Mark Millar stated, "Cut to the usual suspects saying everything is fine, but look at the shelf space in Barnes & Noble. Talk to your retailers about cuts he's making. A strong Marvel and DC urgently required, again, for the health of the overall American industry. This is an iceberg tip." Obviously calling out a lot of the shills out there who would like you to believe because manga is doing so great and they broke records in 2022 that everything in the American comic book industry is just amazing. DC and Marvel are thriving because Shueisha is absolutely dominating the market. DC and Marvel are doing great. Batman's doing great because Dogman is selling orders of magnitude more graphic novels in sales and units than Batman can, all combined with all of his stories. Absolutely getting pantsed by manga and Dogman for the most part. Obviously, there are a few other things out there that are doing really well, like Allure Olympus. Every once in a while, there is a kid's graphic novel that breaks through, but it's really the Dad Pilkey show when you look at that. And even the usual suspects are at least somewhat admitting that something is wrong. You're hearing creators say, hey, the industry is healthier than ever. I can get all my stories published, but nobody wants to buy them. And I'm not actually making any money on my creator-owned stuff anymore. We're having retailers call out and say, hey, listen, nobody's interested in Marvel Comics right now other than the variant covers. There's something wrong here. You're seeing publishers go out of business. I mean, watching IDW die for the last 4 years is just, it's pathetic. You know, it's sad, but it's well earned at the same time. You know, these people do need to take responsibility for these things, and we'll never be able to fix any of this stuff. DC and Marvel will never be able to look in the mirror and actually realize the mistakes that they've made over the past 5 to 10 years. Speaking of that, a fan replied calling for more self-contained stories, fewer tie-in events, lower prices for single issues, and or giving Peter Parker actual development, to which Mark Millar responded, the market is changing is no excuse. Jeff Johns can move 1 million units of his Joker story, so the market is there if the stories are good. People just want better mainstream comics. This is the fiscal backbone of comic stores, and it's breaking. And I do appreciate somebody with the reputation in the comic book industry, the history of sales, the investment in the comic book industry that people look up to, like Mark Millar, going out there and saying, no, this is bullshit. Yeah, the prices are going up. There are too many events. But when you actually deliver something people want to read, they still show up at their shop. They still put it on their pull list, and they still show up every single week, month, to buy that comic book because they're craving. There is an insatiable desire among American comic book readers for something good, for something that actually meets expectations, for something that isn't just barely average, feeling like it stands out. And there are really good examples of this happening. And obviously Miller there was referring to Jeff Johns' Batman the Three Jokers, which might not have been the greatest story in the world, but the art from Jason Fabok was world-class. The story was interesting enough, and it was paying off something that was built up in DC Rebirth the last time DC was actually outselling Marvel Comics on a monthly basis, and did so for quite a while before they fell behind. But there was something there. People wanted DC Rebirth, and they certainly wanted the payoff to the reveal before Rebirth even kicked off that there were 3 Jokers in reality out there, and he delivered the story. It wasn't the greatest story in the history of the world, but it was very damn solid. The art was amazing and people were into it. And guess what? It didn't just sell single comic book issues in the direct market. It transferred over to the book chain. People were going into Barnes & Noble. People were going onto Amazon, and they were buying that book because they wanted it to be a part of the collection. They wanted to proudly display it alongside the other stuff that they've enjoyed reading throughout their life. The better example than even what Mark Millar was talking about there in Batman the Three Jokers, really to me, is TMNT The Last Ronin. Talk about a franchise that isn't as notable or well-known as Marvel and DC as a whole, but TMNT is a franchise unto itself. It's certainly been successful on movies, video games, animated. It's done well really across the line. Definitely sells lots of shirts. Definitely sells lots of backpacks, lunchboxes, all that kind of stuff. But the comic books just really went stale when they brought in Sophie Campbell. The sales dried up and there was no interest in TMNT. Well, that means nobody wants to buy a TMNT comic, right? It's not that people don't want to buy a Sophie Campbell trans allegory TMNT brothers in the background so we can celebrate, the new female turtle comic book. That's not what the problem is. They just weren't interested in TMNT comic books. And then The Last Ronin comes out. It's based on, notes from 30 years ago from the original creators, Eastman and Laird, and people get excited. They bring on some pretty good artists. And guess what? The first printing was so big, it was ordered so heavily that they had to do it in 2 or 3 printings because they couldn't afford to print that many comic books at the time. That's how much interest there was in TMNT The Last Ronin. It was a cool concept. It was characters people liked, and it was something that people were interested in. That got people back to the comic book shop. That got people in the door every Wednesday when one of those issues was released, and they were excited. Even though it was delayed to hell, just went into production hell and couldn't meet their deadlines, but people never gave up on it. They loved it to the very end because it was something different that they wanted with the characters that was absolutely awesome. Something that, for the most part, across the board, Marvel and DC refuse to do these days. They don't want to invest anything in the characters. They go as cheap as possible. They bring in the worst creators possible who don't want to tell stories anymore. They want to teach. They want to lecture. They want to tell you how to live your life. I don't come to superhero comic books for that. Nobody does. We come here for great stories. TMNT The Last Ronin delivers a fantastic story, actually blows away my expectations. And guess what's the one Western comic book that's been able to compete with manga to month basis in the bookstore market itself? TMNT The Last Ronin, especially the hardcover edition, because people want that book. There's an insatiable desire for that book. It's a good story with characters people like, and it's competing in the book market with manga, despite manga having these sales that are dwarfing everybody, because it's the one thing that really makes sense. It's the one thing that every TMNT fan in the world wants to read. It's the story they were looking for, and they aren't really delivering that at all on a week-to-week basis, not even a month-to-month basis. The last time Marvel did anything that was really awesome, that got people excited and brought them back, was House of X Powers of 10. And that wasn't even being faithful to the X-Men characters. That was just the excitement that they were going to do something different that was awesome, that just wasn't a rehash of God Loves, Man Kills all over again, which we've been subjected to for like 20 or 30 fucking years now. Of course, that did fall off once we got into Dawn of X or where the hell it was, and they just watered it down. But it can happen. There is a desire for these comic books. There are people out there just waiting for Marvel and DC to do something awesome with their character. That is what people are waiting for, and they are not delivering it. No more excuses. The customers have told you what's wrong. The YouTubers have told you what's wrong. Mark Millar is fucking telling you what's wrong. It's time to listen. And this is the thing I was alluding to earlier that I thought was kind of funny. Retweeting Millar's initial question, Tim Seeley declared in a since-deleted tweet, "My guess is because comics as an industry were pillaged for IP and collectible graded crap with no investment in building new readership, and now the chickens are coming home to roost, Mark." And then claiming in a later deleted tweet, "I've been screaming for 10 goddamn years that making comics more expensive and for fewer people would bite us in the ass hard one day. And now people are like, oh gosh, what happened?" And I think it's insane that somebody like Tim Seeley would say that, because when Mark Millar says, cut to the usual suspects saying everything is fine, he's talking about Heidi McDonald and Tim Seeley. Every time there's a quarterly or yearly report on the American comic book industry, Tim Seeley says everything's fine. Manga's selling. Dogman is selling. That means DC and Marvel are in the best place ever. It doesn't matter that comic shops are going out of business. It doesn't matter that comic shops aren't even comic book shops anymore. They're gaming shops. They're magic shops. They're everything that can actually generate money in the geek space while still being able to offer comic books at the same time. And that's what they devolved into for the most part. And Tim Seeley has been championing this for like 4 fucking years at this point. When has he been screaming that they've made comic books too expensive and been making them for fewer people, i.e. an audience that doesn't exist? I've been saying that. Your boy Zach's been saying that. EVS has actually been saying that one. I would say Doug Ernst was saying that. I would say Captain Cummings was saying that. I would say Captain Frugal was saying that. I would say Anglantine is still saying that. But I've never fucking seen Tim Seeley say that, certainly not in public. If he tweeted that for the last 10 years, he wouldn't be writing for Marvel or DC, and none of his books would be approved for any of the smaller publishers because he would have been out of line. They would have blacklisted him for ever having the audacity to claim that comic book readers and publishers are the agents of their own demise. It's my fault for having a comic book YouTube channel with a little common sense, pointing out the obvious on a fucking weekly, daily basis for 6 years now. I'm the reason this happened. You can't blame it on the comic book pros. It's such bullshit that Tim Seeley would come out there and be like, yes, I've been championing common sense, more than anybody. No, you haven't. And if you have, you've been doing it behind the scenes to people that you knew had no influence and wouldn't cancel you because of it. You've been going along with the crowd more than most people. And I will give Tim Seeley some credit, because some people think I'm a little bit too hard on Tim Seeley. He doesn't block everybody. He doesn't block everybody. He will have a conversation with you on social media. He won't freak out with you for the most part. But if you are of the wrong persuasion, you vote for the wrong person, and you were friends with Tim Seeley, he's not friends with you anymore. I talked to multiple people that said they were friends of Tim Seeley back in the day, and he refuses to speak to him nowadays. So don't act like you've been like the voice of sanity for anything, Tim Seeley. You've been a part of the problem. You are the guy that Mark Millar is referring to when he says the usual suspects saying everything is fine. Well, everything is not fine. And I imagine Mark Millar is going to get in a little bit more trouble, which he doesn't care because he's a Netflix executive. He doesn't need to make comic books anymore. And that's like the thing that really blows my mind. Of all the people in comic books in 2023, Mark Millar should be screaming the least. He's made it. He doesn't need that gig. It doesn't really probably even matter to his bottom line if Big Game sells a single comic book. He's made it. He's outside the industry. He's transcended comic books, but he's the only one that still seems to have fucking passion anymore. Think about all the great comic pros that it seem to have walked away and they don't care anymore. This dude is still sticking around. He's still standing up for what's right, providing some common sense and saying, hey, we can't ignore this any longer. We are putting people out of business. People are being hurt by these bad decisions. And really, he's the guy that has the least to lose in all of this because Mark Millar doesn't have to depend on comic books anymore. He already made it. It's crazy that he's the one. But thank God there is one comic pro out there that is willing to say what's happening and put a voice behind some common sense, that has the reputation that he has. So God bless Mark Millar. I don't know where we would be without him. It would be worse, trust me. Now, last time he did this, he came on the channel and people threw a temper tantrum saying that he was not being honest, like nothing he said was right. And it was really funny. The response was great. I talked about it here. We made fun of him and pointed out why all these guys were numbskulls. And Mark Millar has been right all along. Definitely check it out right here. There's also a link in the video description.